Blood is thicker than water, but greed? Greed is thicker than blood. When Abigail was stripped of her rightful inheritance by her own family, she was left with nothing but a worthless, rotting cabin in the freezing Oregon wilderness. Or so they thought. Driven out into the bitter cold, Abigail stumbled upon a secret her grandfather took to the grave, a hidden fortune that would not only change her life forever, but unleash a ruthless war with the very people who threw her away. This is a story of betrayal, revenge, and a multi-million-dollar secret buried in the dust. The rain in Portland, Oregon did not merely fall. It wept against the towering glass windows of the Gallagher and Associates law firm. Abigail Fletcher sat in the heavy mahogany chair, her black morning dress still damp at the shoulders. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the polished wood of the conference table. Her grandfather, Elias Fletcher, was gone. For 5 grueling, beautiful, and heartbreaking years, Abigail had been his sole caretaker. While the rest of the family treated Elias like a forgotten relic, Abigail had put her life on hold. She abandoned her burgeoning career in architecture to manage his medications, cook his meals, and listen to his rambling, cryptic stories about his youth and the logging camps. She had loved him fiercely, and his passing to a sudden stroke had left a hollow void in her chest. Sitting across from her was her uncle Edward, wearing a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than Abigail's car. Next to him sat his wife, Aunt Sylvia, draped in tasteless, heavy gold jewelry, and their son Preston, who was busily scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. They had not visited Elias in 3 years. They hadn't even shown up to the hospital when he was on life support. Yet, here they were, punctual and practically salivating for the reading of the will. Attorney Henry Gallagher cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at Abigail with a flicker of unmistakable pity before looking down at the heavy, ivory-colored document. "Let us begin," Henry said, his voice a dry baritone. The estate of Elias John Fletcher, valued at approximately $4.2 million in liquid assets and real estate, is to be distributed as follows. Abigail didn't care about the money. She just wanted the family home, the old Victorian house where she had spent her childhood in the last 5 years of her life. Elias had promised it to her countless times. "This old place is yours, Abby," he would say, tapping his cane against the hardwood floors. "You're the only one who respects its bones." To my son, Edward Fletcher, Henry read, "I leave the entirety of my financial portfolios, mutual funds, and banking accounts, totaling roughly $3.8 million. Abigail blinked. That couldn't be right. Elias had explicitly told her he was splitting the liquid assets to set up a trust for her future. Furthermore, Henry continued, the paper rustling in the quiet room to Edward Fletcher, "I also leave the primary residence located at 412 Alder Street, Portland, Oregon, and all its contents." The room spun. Abigail gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white. "Wait," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "Mr. Gallagher, there must be a mistake," Grandpa said. "He promised me the house." "We drew up the papers 2 years ago." Henry let out a heavy sigh and looked over his glasses. "You are referring to the 2024 draft, Abigail. However, an amended codicil was filed and notarized exactly 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks ago? Abigail shot up. 6 weeks ago, Grandpa was on heavy painkillers for his hip. He was hallucinating half the time. Who notarized this? Uncle Edward leaned forward, steepling his manicured fingers. "Now, Abigail, let's not cause a scene," he purred, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dad was of perfectly sound mind. I took him to lunch, and he expressed deep regret about burdening a young woman with such a massive property. He wanted you to be free. He realized I was better equipped to manage the estate." "You manipulated him!" Abigail shouted, tears of pure betrayal finally spilling over. "You cornered a dying, medicated old man and made him sign away everything." "Watch your tone, little girl," Sylvia snapped, her eyes flashing with cold cruelty. "Edward is the rightful patriarch of this family. You were merely the hired help." "Let us finish," Henry interjected sharply, though he looked deeply uncomfortable. "There is one final provision. To my granddaughter, Abigail Fletcher, I leave parcel 42, the 5-acre plot, and the structure upon it, located in Oak Haven, Oregon, near the Deschutes National Forest." Preston snorted, pocketing his phone. "Congratulations, Abby. You own a tax-delinquent mud pit and a shack that's been rotting since the Great Depression." Abigail felt the floor give way beneath her. Parcel 42. She vaguely knew of it. It was a useless, abandoned patch of wilderness. Elias had bought in the 1960s and never developed. It had no power, no running water, and was located 3 hours away in the absolute middle of nowhere. "That's it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain lashing the window. "That is the entirety of the will," Henry confirmed softly. "As per the legal stipulations regarding the primary residence, Abigail, you have 14 days to vacate the Alder Street property." 14 days. She was effectively homeless, unemployed, and entirely broke, having spent her own meager savings on Elias's out-of-pocket medical expenses. As the meeting adjourned, Edward approached her in the hallway. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet and extracted 10 crisp $100 bills. He held them out to her, a sickening smile on his face. "For gas," Edward said softly. "And moving boxes. Don't say your family never did anything for you. Pack your things, Abigail. I have contractors coming on the 15th to gut the kitchen." Abigail stared at the money, then at her uncle's smug face. She didn't take the cash. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out into the freezing Portland rain, the brutal reality of her new life crashing down upon her. She had been thrown to the wolves. But as she drove back to the house she no longer owned, a quiet, hardened resolve began to form in her chest. She would survive this. She had to. The drive to Oak Haven was a treacherous, agonizing journey through the winding, rain-slicked mountain passes of the Cascades. Abigail's 10-year-old Subaru rattled and protested against the steep incline, the trunk packed to the ceiling with everything she owned. Clothes, a few cherished books, her drafting tools, and the old woolen blankets her grandfather used to wrap himself in. Oak Haven was barely a town, a forgotten logging community consisting of a gas station, a rusted diner, and a hardware store that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1985. Abigail stopped at the hardware store to ask for directions to Parcel 42. The owner, a grizzled man named Benjamin Foster, squinted at her from across the counter. "Fletcher property? Up near Pine Ridge?" He let out a low whistle. "Honey, nobody's been up there in 20 years. The road is washed out, and the cabin. Well, cabin is a generous word. It's mostly termites and raccoon nests holding hands at this point. You sure you want to go up there in this weather?" "I don't have a choice," Abigail said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. She bought a heavy-duty tarp, an axe, a box of nails, and a kerosene lantern with the last of her credit card limit. When she finally navigated the deeply rutted, overgrown dirt road leading to her inheritance, the sight of it nearly broke her. Benjamin had been right. The cabin was a disaster. It sat in a gloomy clearing surrounded by towering, suffocating pine trees. The roof sagged ominously in the center, completely overtaken by a thick layer of green moss. The front porch had collapsed inward, its wooden beams rotted into black mush. The windows were either smashed or filmed over with decades of grime. It looked like a decaying corpse left to rot in the woods. Abigail killed the engine. The silence of the forest was absolute, save for the steady dripping of rain from the canopy. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel and finally let herself cry. She cried for her grandfather, for the betrayal of her family, and for the terrifying reality of her destitution. But tears wouldn't fix the roof. For the next 2 weeks, Abigail entered a state of pure adrenaline-fueled survival. Her hands grew calloused and blistered. She learned how to chop deadwood for the rusted cast iron stove she found inside, which thankfully still had an intact chimney. She spent days hauling out debris, rotted furniture, broken glass, and mounds of animal droppings. She scrubbed the soot-stained wooden floors with bleach and river water. She patched the massive hole in the roof with the heavy tarp, securing it during a terrifying thunderstorm that left her soaked to the bone. Every muscle in her body screamed in agony, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emotional trauma. The cabin, despite its horrific condition, possessed a strange, stubborn resilience. The foundational logs, cut from massive old-growth timber, were still solid. Slowly, agonizingly, she carved out a tiny, livable corner near the iron stove, creating a nest of blankets where she could stay warm. On the 15th day, she drove her Subaru down to the edge of the main highway just to get a single bar of cell service. She needed to check her email, hoping desperately for a response to one of the dozens of freelance architectural drafting jobs she had applied for. Instead, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID read Preston. Abigail stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She swiped to answer. "What do you want, Preston?" "Whoa, easy there, mountain woman." Preston's voice drifted through the static, thick with mock affection. "Just calling to check in on my favorite cousin. How's life in the mud?" "If you called to gloat, I'm hanging up." "No, wait," Preston said quickly. "Look, Dad and I were talking. We feel bad about how things went down. Really, we do. We know that property is a biohazard. You're probably freezing your off up there. Get to the point. Dad wants to make things right. He's willing to buy Parcel 42 off you. $10,000 cash. It's more than the land is worth, Abby. You can take the money, move back to civilization, get a nice apartment in Eugene, and start over. Let us take this worthless burden off your hands." Abigail narrowed her eyes, staring out through the rain-streaked windshield. $10,000. It was a lifeline. It was a heated apartment, a warm bed, and groceries that didn't come from a can. But then her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. "Look deeper, Abby. People only show you the cards they want you to see." Edward Fletcher was a shark. He was a corporate liquidator who didn't spend a single cent without expecting a massive return. He had already stolen a $4 million estate from her. Why would he suddenly offer $10,000 out of the goodness of his heart for a piece of land he had mocked only 2 weeks ago? $10,000? Abigail said slowly. "Yep, I can have a courier bring the contract to Oakhaven by tomorrow morning. Just sign it and the wire transfer hits your account instantly." Preston sounded just a little too eager. The boredom was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a tight, desperate energy. They wanted this land. They wanted it badly. "No," Abigail said. There was a dead silence on the line. "Excuse me?" Preston asked, his friendly facade slipping instantly. "I said no, Preston. Tell Edward I'm keeping the cabin. It's my home now." "Don't be a stupid bitch, Abigail," Preston snarled, his true colors bleeding through. "You're going to freeze to death out there. That land is ours. Dad just didn't want to deal with the probate taxes on it, but we need it back. We will tie you up in court for years until you're bankrupt. Take the money." "If it's worthless, why do you need it back?" Abigail asked coldly. Preston hesitated. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Because it's family land," he stammered. "Rotten hell, Preston." Abigail hung up, powered off her phone, and tossed it into the passenger seat. Her blood ran cold, but not from the Oregon chill. The family had betrayed her for the house and the money, yes, but they had made a mistake. They had let her keep parcel 42 because they thought it was garbage. Now, something had changed. They had found out something. Elias had left her this cabin for a reason, and she was going to tear the place down to the studs if she had to, just to figure out why. That night, the Pacific Northwest unleashed its fury. A massive gale swept through the Cascade Range, driving sheets of rain sideways against the frail structure of the cabin. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the window panes and groaning through the ancient timber of the walls. Abigail sat huddled by the cast iron stove, wrapped in 3 wool blankets, watching the flames flicker behind the soot-stained glass. The heat was localized, stray 5 feet from the stove, and the air turned to ice. She fed another log into the fire, her mind racing, replaying the phone call with Preston on an endless loop. What did Edward know? Suddenly, a terrifying crack echoed above the howling wind. The entire cabin shuddered violently. Abigail screamed and threw her arms over her head as a massive shower of debris rained down from the ceiling. A heavy, dead branch from a neighboring pine had snapped in the gale and crashed directly onto the roof. She grabbed her flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick cloud of dust filling the room. The tarp had held, but the impact had transferred directly into the masonry of the chimney. Behind the heavy cast iron stove, a large section of the brick and plaster wall had buckled inward, collapsing into a pile of rubble on the floorboards. Cold, wet air immediately began rushing into the room through the cracks. Panic seized her. If she lost the heat from the stove, she wouldn't survive the night. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her heavy work gloves and a crowbar. She had to clear the debris and figure out how to block the draft. Grunting with effort, she began hauling the heavy, jagged pieces of brick away from the wall. The plaster was crumbling, completely rotted from decades of moisture. As she wedged the crowbar behind a stubbornly attached section of brickwork to pry it loose, the metal struck something solid. It didn't make the dull thud of wood or the scrape of stone. It made a sharp, metallic clink. Abigail froze. She aimed the flashlight directly into the dark, gaping hole she had just exposed behind the stove. The bricks weren't the structural wall. They were a facade. Behind them was a perfectly square, hollow space framed by thick, untreated oak planks. And sitting inside that hollow space, covered in 50 years of dust and cobwebs, was an object. Her breath caught in her throat. She dropped the crowbar and reached into the dark, freezing cavity. Her gloved hands met heavy, stiff canvas. She gripped the object and pulled. It was shockingly heavy, dragging against the wood with a rough scrape. With a final heave, she pulled it out into the firelight. It was a large steel lockbox, tightly wrapped in heavy, oil-treated canvas, the kind used by sailors to keep out moisture. Abigail's hands shook uncontrollably. She peeled back the stiff, foul-smelling canvas. The steel box beneath was painted a dark olive green, completely free of rust thanks to the oiled cloth. On the front hung a massive, solid brass padlock. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her heavy framing hammer from her toolbox. The noise of the storm masked the deafening clang as she brought the steel head of the hammer down onto the brass lock. Clang, the metal dented. Clang, the shackle bent. Crack. On the fourth strike, the ancient internal mechanism shattered. Abigail threw the hammer aside, pulled the broken padlock free, and flipped open the heavy steel lid. The smell of old paper, dried leather, and a faint metallic tang drifted up into the air. Inside the box lay a collection of items meticulously packed tight. On top rested a thick, leather-bound ledger, its edges frayed. Beneath it was a bundle of heavy, parchment-like paper tied with twine. And in the corner sat a dark velvet pouch, about the size of a grapefruit, heavy enough to weigh down the entire box. Abigail reached for the velvet pouch first. She untied the gold drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. A cascade of heavy, brilliant gold coins spilled into her hand, catching the firelight and flashing with a mesmerizing, warm glow. Abigail gasped. She wasn't a numismatist, but she recognized pure gold when she saw it. They were massive. She picked one up, her thumb tracing the intricate relief of a woman holding a torch and an olive branch. She squinted at the date stamped at the bottom. 1,907. There were at least 30 of them in the pouch. She was holding a small fortune in the palm of her hand, but the gold, as incredible as it was, wasn't the prize. She set the coins down reverently and reached for the leather-bound ledger. She opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant, sharp, and unmistakably belonged to her grandfather, Elias. But the ink was faded, dated back decades. The first entry read, the 14th of October, 1968. The survey is complete. The old maps were right. The veins run deeper than the original prospectors ever dreamed. I have secured parcel 42 under a shell corporation, far away from my father's prying eyes. The timber is just the cover. What lies beneath the ridge is the true legacy. I will keep it hidden until the time is right. If anything happens to me, this secret must only go to someone who proves they have the grit to claim it. The others will only squander it. Abigail stared at the page, her heart thumping wildly against her ribs. She reached for the bundle of parchment and untied the twine. It was a massive, fold-out topographic map of the Oak Haven region, heavily annotated in red ink. But it wasn't just a map of the trees and the rivers. It was a geological survey. Pinned to the map was an official-looking document bearing the seal of the state of Oregon. It was an exclusive mineral rights deed, transferring absolute ownership of the subsurface resources of Parcel 42 and the adjacent 5,000 acres of state land to a company called AF Holdings. A.F. Abigail Fletcher. He had named the holding company after her before she was even born. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her grandfather hadn't left her a worthless piece of swamp. He had left her a dormant gold mine, an untouched fortune buried beneath the earth, complete with the legal rights to extract it. The estate in Portland was pocket change compared to what lay beneath her boots. And Edward. Edward had somehow found out. He must have stumbled upon a stray document or an old tax receipt while going through Elias's Portland office after the funeral. That's why Preston had called. That's why they were suddenly so desperate to buy the land for a measly $10,000. They were trying to steal a fortune out from under her, legally and quietly. Abigail looked around the ruined, freezing cabin. The wind was still screaming outside, but she no longer felt the cold. A fierce, burning fire had ignited in her chest. Her family had taken her home. They had stolen her inheritance. They had thrown her into the wilderness to die. But they had made a fatal error. They had handed her the map to their destruction. Abigail carefully placed the deed, the map, and the gold back into the steel box. She snapped the lid shut. Tomorrow, she would drive into town. She would find a lawyer, she would appraise the coins, and she would prepare for war. The morning after the storm broke crisp and blindingly clear, the Oregon sun reflecting off the rain-soaked pines. Abigail did not sleep a single wink. She sat wrapped in her grandfather's wool blanket, her eyes fixed on the heavy steel lockbox sitting on the scarred wooden floorboards. The gold coins inside felt like a radioactive secret, humming with a power that could either save her life or get her killed. She knew she couldn't stay in the cabin today. Edward and Preston were desperate, and desperate men did not wait patiently. If they suspected she had found the cash, or if they were simply trying to bully her off the land to seize the mineral rights, they would be coming back. Abigail, dressed in her warmest clothes, packed the leather ledger, the state of Oregon mineral deed, and the topographic map into a waterproof backpack. Then, she took 3 of the heavy 1,907 double eagle gold coins, wrapped them tightly in tissue paper, and shoved them deep into her coat pocket. The rest of the gold she buried beneath the loose floorboards under the heavy cast iron stove, dragging a massive pile of firewood over the spot to conceal it. She drove 2 hours south to Bend, Oregon, a bustling city that felt like a different universe compared to the rotting isolation of Oak Haven. Her first stop was a fortress-like branch of U.S. Bank in the downtown district, where she rented the largest safe deposit box available, securing the original deeds and the ledger behind a wall of steel and dual-key locks. Her second stop was a high-end numismatics dealer on Wall Street, a shop called Cascade Rare Coins and Bullion. A bell chimed as she entered, the air smelling of furniture polish and old paper. The owner, an older gentleman whose name tag read Mitchell, peered at her over his reading glasses. "How can I help you, miss?" Mitchell asked politely, though his eyes darted to her mud-caked boots and worn flannel jacket. Abigail walked to the counter, reached into her pocket, and placed the 3 tissue-wrapped bundles on the glass display case. She unwrapped them slowly. The heavy gold clinked against the glass. Mitchell's demeanor changed instantly. He reached under the counter, pulled out a jeweler's loupe, and clicked on a high-intensity halogen desk lamp. He picked up the first coin with a pair of cotton-tipped tweezers, his breath hitching audibly. "Good heavens," Mitchell whispered. 1,907 Liberty Head double eagles? And, my God, the condition. These haven't been circulated. They look like they were struck yesterday. Where on earth did you find these? "They were my grandfather's," Abigail said, keeping her voice entirely flat, giving away nothing. "Are they worth the spot price of gold?" Mitchell let out a breathless laugh. "The spot price of gold for a 1-ounce coin is roughly $2,000. But these are numismatic holy grails in this condition. I would grade these at an MS 63, perhaps higher. If you put these in an auction house, they could fetch $20,000 to $25,000 each." Abigail's knees nearly buckled, but she gripped the edge of the glass counter to steady herself. There were at least 30 of them back at the cabin. "I don't have time for an auction," Abigail said firmly. "I need cash today. I will sell you 2 of them right now if you can give me a fair dealer buyout price." Mitchell didn't hesitate. 10 minutes later, Abigail walked out of the shop with a cashier's check for $38,000 and $10,000 in crisp $100 bills stuffed into her bag. She kept the third coin. She was no longer a destitute, grieving granddaughter. She was funded, she had a war chest. She immediately walked 3 blocks down to a towering glass office building and took the elevator to the 12th floor. The brass plaque on the door read, "Harper & Associates, Civil Litigation." Attorney Victoria Harper was a shark in a tailored pantsuit. She had a reputation in Deschutes County for being ruthless, brilliant, and entirely immune to the old boys club politics of Portland's elite. Abigail sat in Victoria's plush office, laid the cashier's check on the desk as a retainer, and handed over high-quality photocopies of the documents she had found in the cabin. Victoria adjusted her glasses, reading through the 1,968 deed. As she read, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "Your grandfather, Elias, was a remarkably paranoid and brilliant man," Victoria said, tapping her manicured nail against the paper. "Your uncle Edward completely botched this. When he manipulated your grandfather into amending the will to seize the Portland estate and the financial portfolios, he assumed he was taking everything of value. He left you parcel 42 because it's legally classified as barren surface land. But the gold mine?" Abigail asked, her heart racing. "That's the beauty of it," Victoria explained, leaning forward. "In the state of Oregon, surface rights and subsurface mineral rights can be severed. Your grandfather didn't own the mineral rights under his own name. He owned them under AF Holdings, a private corporate entity. And looking at these trust documents attached to the deed, AF Holdings was set up to transfer sole executive ownership to you upon his death. Edward didn't steal the gold mine because Edward didn't even know AF Holdings existed. Legally, you are sitting on a multi-million-dollar subsurface empire, and there is absolutely nothing your uncle can do to claim it through probate." Abigail let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 weeks. "So, I'm safe?" "Not entirely," Victoria warned, her expression turning deadly serious. "If Edward and Preston have suddenly realized what is buried under that land, they will try to force you to sell the surface property before you figure it out. If they own the surface, they can tie up your access to the subsurface rights in court for a decade. They will use intimidation, harassment, and legal loopholes to bleed you dry. You need to go back to that cabin and hold your ground. Do not let them on the property. I am filing a preemptive restraining order and an ironclad trespassing injunction against Edward and anyone on his payroll. Abigail drove back to the treacherous mountain roads of Oak Haven with a fire in her veins. She stopped at the local hardware store, buying heavy-duty padlocks, motion sensor floodlights, and a Mossberg 1.2 gauge shotgun, which she legally purchased with her new funds, along with 2 boxes of shells. When her Subaru finally crested the muddy ridge leading to her cabin, her blood ran cold. A sleek black Lincoln Navigator was parked dead center in her driveway, its tires sunk deep into the Oregon mud. 2 large men wearing heavy Carhartt jackets and steel-toed boots were standing on her ruined front porch, wielding crowbars. They were actively trying to pry the front door off its hinges. Standing behind them, holding an umbrella and smoking a cigarette, was her cousin, Preston. Abigail slammed her car into park, grabbed the unloaded shotgun, and stepped out into the freezing drizzle. "Get away from my house!" Abigail screamed, her voice echoing through the silent, towering pines. The 2 men stopped, dropping their crowbars, and turned to look at her. Preston laughed, tossing his cigarette into the mud. Well, if it isn't the mountain troll," Preston sneered, taking a step toward her. "Relax, Abby. Dad sent some contractors up to assess the foundation. We're just trying to help you out before this place collapses and crushes you. We brought the contract for the $10,000. Sign it, and you can leave right now." "I told you I'm not selling," Abigail said, racking the pump of the shotgun. The loud, metallic clack-clack echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet forest. She hadn't loaded it, but they didn't know that. The 2 hired thugs immediately threw their hands up and backed away from the porch. Preston's smug smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine fear. "Are you insane?" Preston yelled, putting his hands up. "Put that away, you psycho. You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my property before I call the Deschutes County Sheriff," Abigail said, her hands remarkably steady. "You are trespassing on a federally registered mineral claim owned by AF Holdings. My lawyer has already filed an injunction against your father. If you or anyone from your firm sets foot on this dirt again, I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." Preston's face went entirely white. The mention of AF Holdings hit him like a physical blow. He knew. They definitely knew. "You don't know what you're messing with, Abigail," Preston hissed, his voice dropping its mocking tone, revealing a desperate, frantic edge. "You can't develop this land. You don't have the capital. Dad does. You're going to ruin everything." 10 seconds, Preston," Abigail said, raising the barrel an inch. Preston cursed viciously, turned on his heel, and marched back to the Navigator. The 2 thugs scrambled into the back seat. The luxury SUV spun its tires frantically in the mud before finally gaining traction and speeding away down the treacherous logging road, leaving deep, violent scars in the earth. Abigail stood in the freezing rain for a long time, watching them go. The war had officially begun, and she had just fired the first shot. The retaliation was swift, brutal, and entirely legal. Within 48 hours of the confrontation at the cabin, Abigail received a massive stack of legal documents delivered by a county process server. Uncle Edward had mobilized the multi-million-dollar legal team of his firm, Fletcher Wealth Management. They weren't suing her for the land, they were suing to freeze the estate. Edward filed an emergency motion in Portland probate court claiming that Elias Fletcher had been suffering from undiagnosed dementia as far back as the 1960s, attempting to retroactively invalidate the creation of AF Holdings. It was an absurd, desperate legal reach, but it achieved its immediate goal. It placed a temporary freeze on Abigail's ability to legally lease, sell, or extract any minerals from Parcel 42 until the matter was resolved. "It's a starvation tactic," Victoria Harper explained to Abigail over the phone, the lawyer's voice crackling through the spotty cell reception at the cabin. "Edward knows he can't win the dementia argument. It's legally laughable. But he knows court cases take months, sometimes years. He thinks you're broke. He assumes you can't afford my hourly rate to fight a protracted legal battle, and he's hoping you'll cave and sign the land over just to make the nightmare end. He doesn't know about the gold coins," Abigail noted, stoking the fire in her cast iron stove. "He thinks my only asset is the dirt." "Exactly," Victoria said, sounding fiercely pleased. "Which gives us the ultimate advantage. But, Abigail, something is bothering me. Edward is a corporate liquidator. He deals in safe, boring, low-risk index funds. Why is he fighting this hard and spending this much money in legal fees for an unproven gold deposit? Getting gold out of the ground requires tens of millions in infrastructure. It doesn't fit his profile. He's panicking. I want to know why. What do we do? I'm hiring a forensic accountant, Victoria declared. A man named Wyatt. He used to work for the SEC before moving to private practice. If Edward Fletcher is hiding a motive, Wyatt will find it in the ledger books. Sit tight. Keep your shotgun loaded. For the next week, Abigail lived in a state of hypervigilance. She installed the motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the cabin. She spent her days patching the walls, chopping wood, and reading her grandfather's old ledger, memorizing every geological note, every map coordinate, and every warning he had written about the greed of men. She was no longer just surviving, she was guarding a fortress. Then, on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Cascades, Abigail's phone buzzed. It was Victoria. "Are you sitting down?" Victoria asked. The lawyer's usually composed voice was buzzing with adrenaline. "I am now," Abigail said, pulling a chair close to the fire. "What did Wyatt find?" "He found the smoking gun." "Hell, he found the whole missile silo," Victoria laughed sharply. "Abigail, your uncle isn't trying to steal the land to get rich. He's trying to steal the land to stay out of federal prison." Abigail's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" Wyatt dug deep into Fletcher Wealth Management's offshore holdings, Victoria explained, the words rushing out. Edward's flagship hedge fund has been bleeding out for 3 years. He made massive, catastrophic bets on commercial real estate right before the market crashed. He is leveraged to the hilt, and he's currently facing a margin call of roughly $12 million. Okay, but what does that have to do with my cabin? Everything, Victoria said. 3 months ago, while your grandfather was still alive but heavily medicated, Edward must have been snooping through the house in Portland. He found a copy of the geological survey for Parcel 42. He saw the gold deposit estimates. Desperate for cash to cover his margin call, Edward approached a massive Canadian mining conglomerate called Apex Global Mining. Abigail's mind raced, connecting the dots. He sold them the gold. Worse, Victoria corrected, he pre-leased the extraction rights. He signed a binding corporate contract with Apex Global, promising them exclusive access to the subsurface veins of Parcel 42, and took a massive $8 million advance to temporarily bail out his hedge fund. He signed the contract assuming that upon Elias's death, he would simply inherit the land and hand it over to the Canadians. The silence in the cabin was profound. The sheer scale of her uncle's arrogance was breathtaking. But Elias changed the will, Abigail whispered, staring into the flames. Exactly, Victoria practically shouted. Elias gave the house to Edward, but he deliberately carved out Parcel 42 and gave it to you. He knew. Elias knew Edward was snooping, and he knew Edward was greedy enough to sell the bear's skin before he caught the bear. Edward legally contracted land to a multi-billion-dollar international mining corporation, land that he does not own. Abigail felt a cold, sharp smile form on her lips. And if Apex Global Mining finds out? If Apex finds out they paid $8 million for a fraudulent lease, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, they will obliterate him. They will sue him for breach of contract, seize his remaining assets, and hand his file directly to the FBI for wire fraud. Edward is trapped. His deadline to deliver the land to Apex is the end of the month. That's why Preston offered you $10,000. That's why they sent thugs. It's a desperate scramble to secure the deed before the Canadians realize they've been conned. Abigail leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her like a heavy, magnificent crown. Her family hadn't just betrayed her, they had accidentally handed her the keys to their own destruction. She wasn't just a victim fighting for a cabin anymore, she was the executioner holding the lever to the guillotine. Victoria, Abigail said, her voice calm, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. Draft a letter to Edward's legal team. Tell them I am formally rejecting their mediation request regarding the probate freeze. Done. Victoria agreed. What's the next move? Tell them I will only speak to Edward directly, face to face. Tomorrow at noon, Abigail looked at the steel box hidden beneath the floorboards. Tell him to meet me at the Portland house. It's time to negotiate the terms of his surrender. The drive back to Portland was drastically different from Abigail's panicked, heartbroken exodus a month prior. Then she had been a terrified girl grieving her grandfather, clutching $100 bills like a beggar. Now, she gripped the leather steering wheel of her Subaru with the icy, calculated composure of an executioner. The heavy, gold, double eagle coin sat in her cup holder, catching the pale Oregon sunlight, a constant, physical reminder of the power she now wielded. She pulled onto Alder Street right at noon. The Grand Victorian house, the only real home she had ever known, looked entirely different. A massive commercial dumpster sat on the pristine front lawn, overflowing with the original cherrywood cabinets and stained glass fixtures she had loved so much. Edwards contractors had wasted no time erasing Elias Fletcher's legacy. The sight of it sent a hot, sharp spike of anger through her chest, but she clamped it down. Anger was sloppy. She needed to be surgical. Waiting on the sprawling wraparound porch were Uncle Edward, Aunt Sylvia, and Preston. Edward wore his usual bespoke suit, but the impeccable facade was cracking. He looked haggard, the skin around his eyes was bruised with exhaustion, and his usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled. Preston was pacing nervously, while Sylvia stood with her arms tightly crossed, her heavy gold bracelets clinking in the breeze. Abigail stepped out of the car, carrying nothing but a sleek leather portfolio Victoria Harper had prepared for her. Abigail, Edward said, attempting to project his usual booming patriarchal authority. He descended the porch steps, offering a tight, patronizing smile. I'm glad you came to your senses. Victoria Harper is a notoriously expensive attorney. You must be drowning in legal debt by now. Come inside, let's sign the transfer for parcel 42, and I'll graciously double my offer. $20,000, and I'll call off the probate freeze. Abigail didn't take his outstretched hand. She didn't even look at it. She walked past him, her boots clicking sharply against the wooden porch, and stepped through the open front door into the gutted foyer. Close the door, Edward, Abigail commanded, her voice ringing out in the empty, echoing house. Sylvia scoffed, following her inside. Excuse me? You don't give orders in this house, little girl. You are a guest, a very unwelcome one. Abigail turned slowly, fixing her aunt with a gaze so entirely devoid of warmth that Sylvia actually took a half step backward. Sylvia, if you speak to me again, I will make sure the IRS audits your personal jewelry collection down to the last carat. Sit down and shut up. Preston opened his mouth to intervene, but Edward held up a shaking hand, shutting the front door. The heavy thud echoed through the stripped walls. What is the meaning of this theatrical nonsense, Abigail? Edward demanded, though his voice lacked its usual venom. We are offering you a lifeline. Take the money. Abigail unzipped the leather portfolio. She didn't pull out the deed to parcel 42. Instead, she pulled out a thick stack of documents stamped with the logo of a forensic accounting firm, followed by a crisp, heavily redacted copy of a corporate contract. She tossed them onto a dust-covered sawhorses that the contractors had left in the center of the living room. Apex Global Mining, Abigail said, the words falling like anvils in the quiet room. All the blood instantly drained from Edward's face. He physically staggered, his hand reaching out to grip the edge of the nearest wall stud. Preston let out a choked gasp, backing away as if the papers on the table were radioactive. I don't know what you're talking about, Edward stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. Don't insult my intelligence, Edward. It makes me want to destroy you faster, Abigail said, stepping forward. My forensic accountant traced the $8 million wire transfer from Toronto directly into your failing hedge fund's Cayman Island holding account. You sold the subsurface extraction rights of Parcel 42 to a Canadian conglomerate to cover your margin calls. The only problem is, you leased land owned by AF Holdings. Land you never owned. Edward? Sylvia whispered, looking at her husband in absolute horror. What is she talking about? What margin calls? You didn't tell your wife? Abigail mocked softly. Edward is broke, Sylvia. He bet the family firm on commercial real estate and lost. He committed federal wire fraud to cover it up. You little bitch, Preston snarled, lunging forward. Abigail didn't even flinch. Take one more step, Preston, and my lawyer hits send on an email to the legal department at Apex Global. They will freeze your father's accounts by midnight, and the FBI will be knocking on this door by breakfast. Preston froze in his tracks, his fists clenched, chest heaving with panicked breaths. Edward looked like he was going to vomit. His knees gave out, and he collapsed onto a paint-splattered wooden crate. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man facing the absolute ruin of his entire life. How did you find out? Edward whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Grandpa knew, Abigail said, her tone softening just a fraction at the mention of Elias, before hardening into steel. He knew you were a vulture. He knew you were snooping through his files while he was dying. He deliberately amended the will to give you this house, keeping your eyes completely off the holding company until it was too late. He laid a trap for you, Edward, and you walked right into it, blinded by your own greed. Edward buried his face in his hands. Apex. Their final deadline to begin geological testing is next Friday. If I don't provide the clear title to the surface land by then, the contract goes into default. They will audit the lease. They will find out. I know, Abigail stated. Which brings us to the terms of your surrender. Edward looked up, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. Surrender? I hold the deed to AF Holdings. I hold the mineral rights. I can validate your fraudulent lease with Apex Global by countersigning it as the legal executive of the land. I can save you from federal prison, Edward. She leaned over the makeshift table, locking eyes with him. But it is going to cost you everything. She pulled 3 final documents from her portfolio and laid them out. Document 1, Abigail said. You will immediately drop the probate dispute. You will sign a legally binding admission that Elias Fletcher was of completely sound mind, validating my sole ownership of Parcel 42 and AF Holdings. Edward nodded frantically. Yes, of course. Done. Document 2, she continued, her voice devoid of mercy. You will completely restore the liquid assets you stole from me. The $3.8 million from Grandpa's portfolios will be wired into my private trust account by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Abigail, please, Edward begged. If I move that much capital right now, my partners will notice. I'll be ruined. You are already ruined, Abigail snapped. You can either be broken free or broken in federal prison. Choose. Edward swallowed hard, a tear spilling down his cheek. Fine, I'll sign it. Document 3, Abigail said, tapping the final piece of paper. The deed to 412 Alder Street. You are going to sign the house back over to me today. And you, Sylvia, and Preston are going to pack whatever fits in your luxury cars and vacate the premises by sundown. You can't do that, Sylvia shrieked, finally breaking her silence. This is our property. Where are we supposed to go? You can go live in a muddy cabin in the Cascades for all I care, Abigail replied, her voice echoing with the ghosts of her own trauma. 4 weeks ago, you threw me out onto the street in the freezing rain. You gave me $1,000 and told me to rot. Now the tables are turned. Sign the papers, Edward, or I make the call. Edward stared at the documents. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold the Mont Blanc pen he pulled from his breast pocket. He looked at his son, then at his wife, finding no salvation in their horrified faces. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. Slowly, agonizingly, Edward Fletcher signed his name to all 3 documents, effectively signing away his wealth, his home, and his power. Abigail gathered the papers, slipping them back into the leather portfolio with precise clinical movements. She zipped it shut. I'll have my lawyer contact Apex Global to validate the lease this afternoon, Abigail said, turning toward the door. Oh, and Edward? He didn't look up, his head bowed in absolute defeat. Tell your contractors to cancel the dumpster, Abigail said. I like the original cherry wood. The dust settled over the Fletcher family with the finality of a collapsing mine shaft. Abigail was true to her word. Victoria Harper successfully validated the lease with Apex Global Mining, legally substituting AF Holdings as the rightful lessor. Edward avoided a federal wire fraud indictment, but his professional life imploded regardless. Without the massive capital he had stolen from Elias's estate to act as a buffer, his hedge fund ultimately collapsed under the weight of his terrible real estate bets. Fletcher Wealth Management was liquidated. Edward, Sylvia, and Preston were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a dreary suburb of Seattle, entirely cut off from the high society life they had so viciously guarded. Abigail, however, was just beginning to build her empire. Once Apex Global Mining realized they were no longer dealing with a desperate, fraudulent hedge fund manager, but rather a brilliant, fiercely protective young woman backed by a ruthless legal team, the negotiations changed drastically. Abigail refused to let them strip mine the beautiful Cascades. Sitting at the head of a massive glass conference table in downtown Portland, flanked by Victoria Harper, Abigail forced the Canadian executives to rewrite the extraction contract. She mandated strict, state-of-the-art subterranean mining techniques that would leave the surface forest of Parcel 42 almost entirely undisturbed. She demanded a 20% royalty on all gross yields, plus a massive environmental restoration bond. They balked at first, but the geological surveys were too rich to walk away from. They signed. Overnight, Abigail Fletcher became one of the wealthiest private landowners in the Pacific Northwest. 6 months later, Abigail drove her brand new matte green heavy-duty truck up the winding, deeply rutted logging road to Oak Haven. The rain was falling softly, the familiar scent of damp pine needles and wet earth filling the air. She pulled into the clearing of Parcel 42. The old, rotting cabin was gone. In its place stood a stunning, custom-built architectural masterpiece. It was constructed from reclaimed timber and massive panes of reinforced glass, blending seamlessly into the surrounding forest. A massive stone chimney, built specifically to house the original antique cast iron stove, anchored the center of the home. She had designed it herself. It was the architectural dream she had put on hold to care for her grandfather, finally brought to life. About a half-mile away, hidden behind a dense ridge of old-growth pines, the hum of Apex Global's state-of-the-art, zero-emissions drilling equipment could barely be heard. They were pulling thousands of ounces of pure gold out of the earth every week, and the checks deposited into AF Holdings were staggering. Abigail walked up the sturdy stone steps to her new porch. She reached into her heavy wool coat and pulled out the 1,907 Double Eagle gold coin. She ran her thumb over the raised edge of Lady Liberty, feeling the weight of the metal. Her grandfather had known what he was doing. He hadn't just left her a fortune. He had given her a profound, brutal test of character. He had forced her to face the absolute worst of her bloodline so she could discover the unbreakable steel within herself. They had thrown her to the wolves, expecting her to be devoured. Instead, she had returned leading the pack. Abigail smiled, slipped the coin back into her pocket, and walked through the heavy oak doors of her new home, leaving the cold rain behind. Abigail's incredible journey proves that the greatest treasures aren't just handed to us, they are forged in the fires of adversity. Her family thought they could discard her like trash, blinded by their own greed and arrogance. But they vastly underestimated the power of a woman pushed to her absolute limits. By combining her grandfather's hidden genius with her own unbreakable grit, Abigail didn't just reclaim her stolen life, she built an empire right on top of the very dirt they deemed worthless. It's a brilliant reminder that sometimes the ultimate revenge isn't destruction. It's massive, undeniable success. If this story of betrayal, hidden millions, and sweet, calculated justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves an epic comeback story, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas and hidden treasure mysteries.